There is a word in almost every European language that came from a single small group of people who lived in a mountain fortress 900 years ago. The word is assassin, and almost everything you have been told about where it comes from is either wrong or was invented by people who wanted these men to sound like monsters. You have probably heard the story. Young men drugged with hashish, carried unconscious into a secret garden built to look like paradise, then told they could return to it forever if they killed on command. It is a fantastic story. It is also almost certainly folklore, written down by a European traveler who arrived in the region roughly a century and a half after the group had already been destroyed. The truth is, stranger and considerably more impressive. These men were not drugged fanatics. They were one of the most disciplined intelligence organizations of the medieval world. They had a library, a school, an agricultural program, a network of mountain castles, and a strategy that was worked out with real intellectual care by a man who almost never left one room. This is who they actually were, why they chose the method they chose, and how a group of about 1,000 people held off two empires without ever fielding an army. Start with the legend, because you need to know exactly what is being claimed before you can see what is wrong with it. The version most people know comes from Marco Polo, and it goes like this. The leader keeps a hidden garden full of fountains, fruit, and every pleasure a young man could imagine. He selects promising young men, drugs them unconscious, and has them carried inside. They wake in the garden, spend days there, and are then drugged again and carried out. They are then told that what they saw was paradise, that the leader holds the key to it, and that dying in his service is the only way back. Polo also reports that the leader would demonstrate loyalty to visiting envoys by ordering men to leap from the fortress walls, and that they did it without hesitating. It is a brilliant piece of storytelling. Every element is designed to make the group seem both inhuman and effortlessly powerful, which is exactly what a legend written by outsiders tends to do. There is one problem. There is no contemporary evidence for any of it. Not the garden, not the drugging, and not the leaping. None of it appears in sources written while the group actually existed. So who were they? The group we call the Assassins were a branch of Shia Islam known as the Nizari Ismailis, and they began with a succession dispute. In 1094, the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt died, and two of his sons had claims. The community split over which one was the rightful successor. The faction that backed the son named Nizar lost in Egypt, but they had a following in Persia, and their leader there was a man who had spent his life preparing for exactly this. Hassani Saba was a scholar, a mathematician, and an organizer, and by every account, including hostile ones, an extraordinarily disciplined man. In 1090, he took a fortress called Alamut, high in the Elburz mountains of northern Persia, and the way he took it is the first clue to how this organization actually worked. He did not besiege it. He sent people to live in the valley below, quietly, for years, converting the garrison from the inside until the castle simply changed hands without a fight. That is not a military technique. That is patience, organization, and an understanding that the fastest way into a strong place is usually through the people already inside it. Alamut means eagle's nest, and looking at it you understand why. It sits on a rock ridge with sheer drops, reachable by one narrow path, at about 2,000 meters. Over the next decades, they took or built dozens more of these across Persia and later Syria. Not a territory exactly, a network of very hard points in other people's countries. They also built something less expected. Alamut had a library that was famous across the region, an irrigation system, and terraced gardens that made the fortress genuinely self-sufficient. And Hassan himself, according to the sources, spent the last 35 years of his life inside that fortress, and reportedly left his own house twice in all that time, which is worth pausing on. The most feared man in the medieval Middle East ran his entire organization from one room in a mountain using letters and messengers. Now the important question, and the one that explains everything else: why kill individuals at all? Why not simply fight? Because fighting was not available to them. The Nizaris were a small religious minority surrounded by the Seljuk Empire, which could field armies of tens of thousands. Estimates of their actual fighting strength across all their fortresses are small. This was never a population that could win a war by weight of numbers, and Hassan knew it. A conventional war would have ended them in a single season, so he asked a different question. If you cannot defeat an empire, What is the smallest thing you can change that alters its behavior? And in the 12th century, the answer to that question is uncomfortably simple. It is one person. Medieval empires were not institutions in the modern sense. Policy was made by specific men, and when one of them died, the entire direction of a state could change within a week. Which means that for a very small organization, removing one carefully chosen man could be worth more than an army it could never afford to raise. So they built a method around that idea, and every single detail of it was chosen deliberately. Start with the weapon because it never changed. Always a dagger, never poison, never a bow, never fire, never anything that could be done from a distance or blamed on an accident. Which is a genuinely strange choice, because poison is safer for the killer and far easier to escape from. They chose the method that guaranteed the killer would be caught. And it was almost always done in public, in a mosque on a Friday, in a crowded court, at a public audience, somewhere with as many witnesses as possible. Which makes no sense at all if the goal is to kill someone. It makes complete sense if the goal is something else entirely. Because the point was never the one man who died. The point was every other powerful man in the region who heard about it the following week. A quiet poisoning teaches nobody anything. A killing in front of 500 witnesses by a man who does not run teaches every ruler within 1,000 kilometers a very specific lesson. The lesson being that no wall, no bodyguard, and no number of soldiers protects you, because the person who reaches you will not be a stranger who got past your guards. Which brings us to the part of this that is genuinely impressive, and that the drugged fanatic story completely erases. These men were not sent out on the day, they were sent out years in advance. They were called Fidei, which means roughly those who sacrifice themselves, and they were trained in languages, local customs, and a trade, so that they could live inside a target's world without ever being noticed. Some are recorded as having spent years in a household, serving, working, becoming familiar, waiting for the single moment when the person they had been sent for was within reach. That is not fanaticism, that is tradecraft. It requires discipline, self-control, and patience over years, which is the exact opposite of a man who has been drugged into obedience. The first killing that made the world pay attention happened in 1092, and the target was arguably the most powerful administrator in the Islamic world. Nizam al-Mulk had effectively run the Seljuk Empire for 30 years. He built its schools, its taxation, and its army structure, and he had been the Nizaris' most determined enemy. He was killed while traveling with the imperial court by a man in the robes of a wandering holy man who was allowed close because nobody sees a beggar as a threat. Within months, the Seljuk Sultan was also dead of other causes, and the empire fell into a succession war that lasted years, which is roughly the outcome Hassan had been aiming for. Over the following century, they killed viziers, governors, generals, and at least one crusader king of Jerusalem, whose death in 1192 is how the story first reached Europe. Which is a detail worth noticing. Almost everything Europe believed about this group came from crusaders who were hearing it from their own local enemies and then improving it in the retelling. They also went after Saladin at least twice and failed both times, and what happened afterwards tells you more about their method than any of the successful attempts. According to the story, Saladin woke one night to find a dagger and a note on the pillow beside him. Whether that literally happened or not, what he did next is documented. He made peace with them. So where does the hashish come from? The name itself, which is the single piece of evidence everyone thinks settles the question. The word assassin does come from an Arabic term applied to this group by their enemies. But historians who work on the sources make a specific and important point about how that term was being used. It appears in hostile Sunni sources as an insult, something closer to rabble or low class or outcast. It was a way of saying, these people are beneath us, not a description of what they consumed. And no source written by the Nizaris themselves, and no contemporary account of an actual killing, describes anybody being drugged before it. The drug is in the legend, not in the record. The garden, the drugging, and the leaping first appeared together in European accounts written long after the group was gone, at a point when nobody left alive could contradict them. Which is how most legends about frightening enemies get made. not by lying exactly, but by writing down what everyone already wanted to believe in a place where nobody could check. The Nizari state at Alamut lasted about 166 years. What ended it was not a Crusader army or a Seljuk sultan, it was the Mongols. In 1256, Hulagu Khan brought an army into the Elburz Mountains, and the fortress that had never been taken by assault was surrendered by its last ruler. The Mongols destroyed the castles methodically, and they burned the library at Alamut, which had been one of the largest collections in the region. A Persian historian who was traveling with the Mongols was allowed to look through that library before it burned. His account is one of our main sources. He was also entirely hostile to them, which is the last thing worth understanding about all of this. Nearly everything we know about them was written by people who wanted them destroyed or by people who had never met one. And the community itself did not end. The Nizari Ismailis still exist in the millions across South Asia, Central Asia, East Africa, and the West as an ordinary and peaceful religious community. So, the real answer to who the assassins were is not the one in the legend. They were a cornered minority who worked out that in a world run by individuals, precision beats scale.